Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters, your Magic the Gathering source that helps you command your budget. This show and episodes like this one are possible thanks to viewers like you. If you're looking for an easy way to help support this show, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe. Also, hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. Another easy way to support this show is with our TCG player affiliate links. So whether you're buying a deck or individual cards, you can use this general link right here or one in the description. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all their support. Hey everyone, Mitch coming in from the Commander's Quarters studio. Welcome to the show. So we've already had an absolutely crazy day with some amazing Kaldheim spoilers, but it just got even crazier. But if you haven't seen my earlier episodes in the day, make sure you go check those out as well, but probably not until after this episode. So make sure you check out the episode on Tibalt got a Fury, which basically just ends the game when you cast a Blasphemous Act. Or how about the commander that I'm calling Zula Goad Cutthroat with Cardor Doomscourge? And of course, don't miss the episode on Magic's very first snow commander that lets you clone any of your things and it goes infinite in the right deck. But before we jump into today's episode, I just want to give a quick spoiler warning. This episode, like all of those episodes and all the previous Kaldheim spoiler episodes, include spoilers, obviously. So if you don't want to see spoilers, stop watching now and maybe go watch a deck tech instead. Okay, we're all on the same page, let's jump into it. And the spoiler in this episode is absolutely insane and I love it. Tibalt's Trickery is a red counterspell for 2. Okay, there's a little more text than just counter target spell, and we'll get to that here in a second, but literally this is the very first hard counterspell in red. Okay, I guess I should clarify that. Not just counter a specific thing, there are those too, and we'll get to them later, but this can counter any spell. Basically, red's first counterspell, okay? Anyways, let's jump into it. It's an instant that costs 1 in red, and it says counter target spell, and then there's a lot more text, so here we go. Choose 1, 2, or 3 at random. Its controller mills that many cards, then exiles from the top of their library until they exile a non-land card with a different name than that spell. They may cast that card without paying its mana cost. Then they put the exiled cards on the bottom of their library in a random order. This is a chaos counterspell. Oh, you were expecting to cast that spell? How about instead you cast something completely different? Now really quick, let's go through why it does what it does and it's worded the way it's worded. You choose 1, 2, or 3 at random, and the spell's controller is going to mill that many cards. This essentially, to an extent, helps prevent any setup shenanigans. So while this is on the stack, if someone's got ways to manipulate the top cards of their library, maybe say like a Brainstorm or a Scry effect, it's not really going to help. 1, 2, or 3 is chosen at random, so it's going to be hard, if not impossible, to know what exactly you're going to be hitting. Then that player starts exiling cards off the top of their library until they hit something that doesn't have the exact same name as the spell that they were casting. In Commander, unless you counter something like Shadowborn Apostle, that's not really gonna matter, but in Standard and other formats, that definitely does matter. It wouldn't be very chaotic if you countered something and then they just hit the exact same thing off the top. Regardless, then that player casts that spell without paying its mana cost, and the rest of their exile cards go on the bottom of their library in a random order. Of course, it's random cause chaos. So when you're countering a spell with this, you are truly playing a game of chance. You're hoping that the thing that they hit is nowhere near as good as the thing that you're countering. Maybe they cast an Eldrazi and you counter it, instead they get a Llanowar Elves. Or maybe you counter that Eldrazi and instead they get Expropriate. You are truly rolling the dice when it comes to this spell. And keep in mind, and we'll dig into it more later, but you can counter your own spell with this. So maybe you cast something small and decide, you know what, let's just take a chance and see if we hit something big off the top. Maybe it doesn't work out, maybe it does, but it's still very red. And speaking of red, and speaking of chaos, of course there is one card that really comes to mind when you're thinking about a similar card to this one. And that would be Chaos Warp. Chaos Warp is the pinnacle of mono red staples. It's an instant that costs 2 in a red and it says the owner of target permanent shovels it into their library, then reveals the top card of their library. If it's a permanent card, they put it onto the battlefield. So this is a very similar, very chaotic card that deals with permanents instead of spells. Mono red definitely can struggle against dealing against certain things like enchantments, so this is kind of a catch-all card. Obviously though, you are taking a chance with this kind of a chaotic effect. They very well might hit something better off the top of their library. However, with Chaos Warp, there is a chance they completely whiff. If they shuffle their library and on top is a non-permanent card, they're not getting it. But with Tibalt's Trickery, there is no chance of whiffing. There's no shuffling involved, they just mill and then exile until they hit something. Now, why were these two cards made differently? I'm not sure. Maybe one theory is that because it's a bigger color pipe break, you've got to take a bigger risk. Or maybe they're trying to do less and less cards that say shuffle on them because it really slows down the game. But if you've got another theory, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Regardless, Chaos Warp is definitely a staple in mono red for a reason, and I can see Tibalt's Trickery becoming a staple as well. Again, when you don't really have any other ways to do something, you're gonna take the one option that you've got. And with mono red players now having access to a Counterspell, they're gonna be using it. Regardless, outside of Chaos Warp, let's take a look at some other somewhat similar cards. Now, I did mention before that red does have spells that can counter things, but they are more specific on what they can counter. For example, Artifact Blast counters an artifact, and Red Elemental Blast and Pyroblast can each counter a blue spell. There's no downside to these, but they are incredibly specific. Now, Red Elemental Blast and Pyroblast can be pretty useful as a counter-spell, and they have some flexibility because you can destroy blue permanents with them. But again, when it comes to red being able to counter absolutely anything, they haven't gotten that until now. Even mono white essentially has a counterspell with Lapse of Certainty. It's an instant for 2 and a white, and it says counter target spell. If that spell is countered this way, put it on top of its owner's library instead of that player's graveyard. Now, unless you've got a way to deal with the top of their library, they're going to get that card back, but not until later. So there is a trade-off with this one as well, and also consider that Tibalt's Treachery only costs 2, whereas this one costs 3. And there's a gigantic difference between a 2-mana counterspell and a 3-mana counterspell. Now, there actually are some ways to even get around that downside. Unfortunately, though, those ways really aren't in red. Drannith Magistrate says your opponent can't cast spells from anywhere other than their hands. Because with this in play, no downside. You counter the spell, they mill, they exile cards, and they can't cast the spell that they get to. But keep in mind that you need to be playing in white as well to use this, so Boros players, be happy. And the same is true with things like Teferi Time Raveler and Teferi Mage of Zhalfir, which both say each opponent can cast spells only anytime they could cast a sorcery. But again, consider that all these things are not in mono red, so the circumstances when they would apply are probably few and far between. And speaking of mono red, let's talk about the potential commanders that might want to play this card. And again, it's probably too early to make this call, but in my opinion, it's probably going to be really hard for any mono red commander not to want this card. So if you're playing a Krenko Mob Boss deck, sure, add in a counterspell that might have a slight downside, or slightly more at some points. You know what you're getting into if you're playing mono red. And I'm not a EDH player, but I definitely think this is going to see play in pretty much all competitive Godo decks as well. But again, this is all just my opinion, but I really believe that it's going to see play in pretty much any mono red deck. In fact, it's probably going to see a ton of play in any X-red deck that doesn't have blue. Because again, those colors really don't have counterspells either. But when it comes to commanders that do have access to blue, it still might see some play in certain circumstances. For example, Golos likes to cast really big spells. So there are an incredibly high percentage of big spells in that deck. Golos decks might already be familiar with countering their own spells with things like Plasm Capture and Spell Swindle. So if you activate Golos and say hit a ramp spell late and Tibalt's Treachery, you can counter that ramp spell and hopefully get something better off the top. Again, you're running a ton of powerful things, so chances are you're gonna hit something better. But again, when it comes to decks that have blue, it's very much gonna be a fringe card. But now as the episode is coming to a close, it's time to talk about my gut feeling on this card. I've pretty much said this before in a lot of ways, but if you're not playing blue, you're gonna be considering this card. Now, will this card see as much play as Chaos Warp in mono red? Only time will tell. And with that, the show is coming to a close, so it's my turn to hear from you. So in the comments below, let me know what your thoughts on this episode are, and as always, thanks again and have a good one.